Thank you very much, Fergus, and thank you also to the organisers of this conference for inviting me to participate and to speak this morning about one of my favourite subjects, and that is the work of prison officers. So, like many of the speakers at this conference, we were given quite precise questions, and the question I was asked to address is this one. It's a very specific question, and I have to say it's really made me think. And if I'm honest, I'll tell you I haven't written the last line of this talk yet. So when somebody asked me yesterday, so what have you said? I think I'm going to ask you as an audience to tell me what I've said at the end. And the question, I guess, that I haven't thought through yet is whether overall there's been a positive or negative effect of privatisation on staff-prisoner relationships. So if you can be my active audience and tell me what you think I've said at the end, that would be quite interesting, I think. So this is a subject that I've been thinking about for many years, the work of prison officers. What kind of expertise or professional status do prison officers have? And I think this question is really asking, what are they worth in the marketplace? That's a big and important question. How should we think about their work? And I've spent a great deal of time in the last decade or so of my research life closely studying and reflecting on the work of prison officers, often with others. This was the result of what Fergus was referring to as the first Whitemore study. I've recently gone back to Whitemore and done it again and found the world a very different place. So today I've been asked to speak in particular about the effects of privatisation on staff-prisoner relationships. So obviously I'm speaking about what's been going on in England and Wales and Scotland. I've tried to keep my eye on the dialogue here and in Northern Ireland. Almost everywhere there's talk, preparation for, temptation towards privatisation, I think. It was quite helpful and challenging to be asked to think specifically about this question, and I think the answer is quite complicated. It comes in 5 related parts. So I'm going to propose that there are effects on culture, on the use of authority, on pay and conditions, on self-legitimacy, I'll explain what that means when I come to it, and then on professionalism and effectiveness, including outcomes. And our knowledge about items 1 to 3 is much further developed than our knowledge on the last 2 items. But we, that is the Cambridge Prisons Research Centre research team, are getting, we think, to a closer understanding of what we mean by staff professionalism and how to measure it. There's also something going on about the changing role expectations of prison officers, which is shaped by broader social and economic trends, of which I think privatisation is one indicator. So it's not just privatisation that's changing the work of prison officers, but privatisation is one symptom of some broader changes going on. I'll say something briefly about this at the end. So let's start with the significance of relationships. It's a well-known maxim that staff-prisoner relationships are at the heart of prison life. As stated in the Control Review Committee's inquiries into a series of disturbances in England and Wales in the 1980s. This is a famous quote for people who are obsessed with or work in prisons. And at the end of the day, nothing else that we can say will be as important as the general proposition that relations between staff and prisoners are at the heart of the whole prison system, and that control and security flow from getting that relationship right. I recently proposed a slight amendment to this statement in an article in a special issue of the European Journal of Criminology on prison officers. This is a plug. There is a special issue on prison officers and prison culture published last year. And in there I argue that it's really staff professionalism or legitimate practices that lie at the heart of prison life. And these things are about a bit more than relationships, or they're about quite specific types of relationships. So put another way, that right relationships in a prison have to have a certain sort of light but present authority flowing through them. This is quite important. People often miss it, and I'll come back to it later. So my earliest observational study of prison officers showed very clearly that without relationships, power could barely flow at all and was often rejected by prisoners. So there was a specific study of the introduction of incentives and earned privileges, We studied all the wings very closely, and on one wing, staff and prisoners were not close at all. And prisoners simply rejected staff attempt to implement the policy of incentives and earned privileges. They weren't having any of staff's coercive power if it didn't come through relationships. On the other wings, where staff-prisoner relationships were much better, staff were able to cajole prisoners into accepting what was a sort of deterioration in their material privileges. So we've seen lots of quite concrete examples of how power works through relationships. So I've argued elsewhere also that the moral quality of prison life is enacted and embodied by the attitudes and conduct of prison officers. Their work is highly skilled and it's quite difficult to articulate. And what the best prison officers describe as common sense is not common sense at all, but it's highly skilled, experience-led, judgment-based decision-making involving minute allocations of risk or trust and a refined and accurate sense of character. So an analogy I've used is, this is out of date now, when David Beckham scores goals and gets interviewed about it on the telly afterwards, he's pretty inarticulate about what it is that he's just done. Everyone in the world knows it's genius, but it's quite hard to put it into words. And I think that the work of the best prison officers is a bit like that, and that they often think it's common sense because they take their knowledge base for granted. But other people don't have that knowledge base. It's quite refined. Governors often say that the best prison officers are worth 100 times what an average prison officer is worth, that the job is done very differently. Prison officers generally do not simply follow instructions. There are too many of them. What they do is pursue order, drawing on instructions selectively, and often working to strongly but implicitly held ideas about the purpose of their work. So when we talk to prisoners about important differences between prisons, they're describing differences in prison officer culture and attitudes. And these cultural differences drive practices. So when officers respect prisoners, they unlock them on time, they facilitate activities and visits, and they help prisoners with their problems and queries. Where they have a legitimate vision of order, let's say order as organisation and stability, rather than discipline and control, officers work very effectively with specialists and other staff rather than seeing them as a threat, and so on. So it's really important to know what's going on in the hearts and minds of prison officers when we try to understand a prison. So let's start with culture. Culture, as we know, differs between prisons. It's a kind of collective construction of social reality, or shared habits of thought, attitude and language, consisting of working rules, but also of emotional frameworks or sensibilities that might explain those working rules. And the type of relationships we find in a prison reflect that culture. Of course, there can be lots of cultures, competing cultures, on different wings or shifts, or certainly between staff grades and between staff and managers. But on the whole, distinctive cultures can be identified and described in different establishments. One of my research interests is trying to do precisely that. So here's an early exploration. This is using the results from a Measuring the Quality of Prison Life survey developed with the assistance of staff and prisoners. And this figure is from my original study with Helen Arnold on measuring the quality of prison life, which was published as Prisons and Their Moral Performance. And what we've done here is include just those dimensions of the quality of life to be positively evaluated by prisoners in each of 5 prisons. There were 14 dimensions in the study, so what comes up here are just the dimensions that prisoners evaluated positively. The dimensions themselves had been identified and operationalised via an extensive set of organised discussions and the use of appreciative inquiry. So they're very prisoner-led. Most of them reflect aspects of officer practice, perhaps with the exception of personal development, which I'll come back to. So they reflect staff ways of relating to prisoners. I haven't included scores in the figures, so sometimes a dimension only just makes it over the threshold. So this model simplifies our findings, and it helps us think about what we might call the value cultures in each establishment. By accident, I've been quite enjoying this process. I'm trying to remember why we included a private prison in this study. This was carried out in 2001, and I can't for the life of me remember why we did it. because we weren't intending to compare public with private sector prisons. So by some accident, I don't think it was our first choice, we happened to have 4 public sector prisons and 1 private sector prison in this study. And the idea of the study was just to learn how to conceptualise and measure the quality of life. So I'm trawling through my old notes at the moment to see if I can retrace our reasoning steps. In retrospect, it turned out to be a really important first move. So if we use this figure to answer the question about how staff-prisoner relationships in a private prison differ from relationships in the public sector, 2 things stand out. First of all, 2 of the public sector prisons are looking pretty vacant. That's a Sex Pistols reference, for those of you who are as old as I am. On moral qualities, that what you'll see in Belmarsh and Wandsworth is not many dimensions that really matter to prisoners of 14 making it over the threshold. So the only values to make it into the figure are safety at both prisons, support at Belmarsh, and order at Wandsworth. We knew these prisons really well by the stage we were at here, and we were quite impressed by the way that doing this with our data reflected the character or culture in each. So Belmarsh, despite being quite a modern prison, had imported some of the cultural traits of large London locals when it opened. Staff could be a little bit dismissive, the prison housed Category A prisoners, and governors felt the staff were overachieving on security. But prisoners felt safe, and staff responded promptly to alarm bells. They felt somewhat supported at an individual level. When we got to digging deeper into the prison, staff reported, they didn't explicitly know this, but they noticed it when they filled in their questionnaires, that they felt closer to prisoners than to senior managers. And so despite an overall cynicism towards prisoners, they were actually a little bit more sympathetic to prisoners and closer to prisoners than they were to their senior managers. We found this in 2 prisons. Prisoners said their one wish for the prison was that the prison service would privatise it. So this was not a good state of affairs. Wandsworth was a traditional custodial prison with staff somewhat occupied with their own safety and with discipline, despite the very ordinary population they housed. These were the 2 prisons in which we found the least trusting relationships with senior managers. And there is a bit of a causal relationship between the relationships between staff and senior managers and staff orientation towards prisoners. So again, prisoners didn't feel treated well. So we see here, less in the other 2 public sector prisons, some of the cultural problems private sector competition was intended to address. Staff prioritising security and discipline, resisting active and constructive regimes, and resisting senior managers in general, and concern to maintain high staffing levels whilst not delivering much to prisoners. There are very different varieties of this culture, but it's easily recognisable. And I'll come back to some important public sector strengths in a minute. But look at Doncaster, which is the private prison. Again, remember this is back in 2001. This prison appears to deliver a prison experience that's more respectful, supportive, fair and humane. It's the only prison in which trust flows. Notice trust appears in Doncaster, not in any of the other prisons. This is going to become a problem later in my argument. But for now, we might suggest at first sight that staff-prisoner relationships are generally better in private sector than in public sector prisons. It's more complicated than that, and I'll complicate it in a minute. We have pretty clear evidence of some fairly negative staff cultures existing in the public sector, but there's also considerable variation in the public sector, which shouldn't be forgotten. And there was a hitch at Doncaster. 2 escapes from the prison shortly after we completed our fieldwork there were linked to good rather than right relationships. So staff were caring, but they were naive. And these are characteristics linked to the timing of privatisation, following shortly after the Wolf Report, an explicit agenda of cultural reform, to inexperience and relative powerlessness. This is linked to lower staffing levels and lower levels of management support. So at Doncaster, the staff vision of prisoners was less cynical, but it was incomplete. So we have 2 extremes here, where staff in the more traditional public sector prisons approach prisoners with scepticism, cynicism and detachment, and prison staff in the public sector support and care for prisoners in ways that are appreciated, but without the necessary vigilance to carry out their security or other functions well. This is a really important tension. So if we move now to the findings of a more recent study, this is a better study because it was explicitly designed to compare the quality of life between public and private sector prisons. This study was conducted with my colleagues Ben Crew and Susie Hulley. And in this study, we revised and developed the key dimensions in the light of some ongoing research. So there's now 21. And they capture much more of these important professionalism as well as relational or harmony aspects of prison work. These are relational dimensions too, but they come closer to the model we're developing, which aims for relationships with power flowing through them. So when we compared these 7 prisons on prisoner evaluations of their quality of life, we found the whole point of the study was to compare public with private sector prisons. But we found such extreme variation in the private sector, we had to abandon our public-private sector comparison, and instead we've split the prisons into 4 quality quadrants from poor to very good. And the private prisons are here, Dovegate and Rye Hill, which were not very good, Forest Bank, which was kind of average, and it's a private prison. We've called it average because it looks like most prisons look. 2 good public sector prisons, Bullingdon and Garth, and then 2 exceptional private prisons, Loudham Grange and Altcourse. And we found it quite interesting to analyse the results by quality and then see what emerged. So this figure, again, shows only the dimensions or aspects of prison quality that are scored 3 and above, a positive score. This time I've included the figures because it's quite important that when you get respect in a bad prison, you only get, it just scrapes over the threshold, where when you get it in a good prison, it starts to get slightly higher. There's a bit more kind of detail here. So the scores in general tend to become more positive as we move from the poor column, A, to the average column and good, and so on. So what this figure shows is, again, in poor prisons, not many dimensions that matter make it over the threshold. Respect does, but it's a pretty narrow version of respect. It's what prisoners call politeness, rather than any deeper sense of the term respect, which would have to include getting things done for prisoners. And we've recently discovered that this is an exclusively private sector phenomenon. If you remember Doncaster, Wandsworth and Belmarsh, respect isn't the first thing to make it over the threshold in public sector prisons. It's much more likely to be safety, security, discipline. So we can see there's different value bases in the 2 sectors. So respect is the first accomplishment of all the private prisons we have evaluated. The pattern is quite different in public sector prisons. So safety, again, starts to emerge, but again, this is safety of a certain sort and at fairly low levels. There's a little bit of care for the vulnerable here at Rye Hill, which is sort of suicide prevention, looking after people on reception into custody, and so on. And at Forest Bank, an average prison, staff professionalism appears. This is staff confidence and competence in the use of authority, and it includes items like staff here treat prisoners fairly when applying the rules. Staff in this prison have enough experience and expertise to deal with the issues that matter to me, and staff in this prison tell it like it is. These are all dimensions that prisoners have helped us to word and identify. What's interesting is this pattern, that once something appears in the figure, you can sort of take it for granted, and other things seem to build on some basic foundations. So as the prisons get better, you retain and grow a bit more respect and courtesy, and you get slightly better staff-prisoner relationships, but you start getting new things. You can start taking staff professionalism for granted. Now you're getting policing and security, a bit more prisoner safety. And what really struck us was that it's not until you get here to one of the good public sector prisons that you get what we're now saying is the most important dimension of all, personal development. And personal development, I'll show you a little bit more detail about personal development. It's when prisoners are saying, I can work on myself in this prison. It's to do with the sort of generativity that Shad was talking about yesterday, that I don't have to worry about my day-to-day survival. I can start to work on myself and my future. But there's a bit more going on in the figure than this. The only dimensions where the good public sector prisons outperform the good private sector prisons are in a dimension called policing and security. This is policing and security, and if I show you some results from policing and security, here it is. There's a lot of information here, but I've asterisked the items that I think are related to staff professionalism, one of our other dimensions. They're very closely related. And if you look at items like staff in this prison turn a blind eye when prisoners break the rules, supervision of prisoners is poor in this prison is run by prisoners rather than staff, and then just look at the percentage of prisoners who are agreeing, or these are agreeing and strongly agreeing with those statements, you'll see there are huge differences. So that in slightly disorganised private prisons, 60% of the prisoners agree that the prison is run by prisoners rather than staff. They don't like it. Whereas in two good public sector prisons, only 7% of prisoners agree that the prison is run by prisoners rather than staff. And this is quite important. So even the very best private sector prisons still had weaknesses in the flow of power domain, with staff often conceding power to prisoners and staff sometimes describing their model of order as somewhat appeasement-driven. So the model of order on which private prisons are based has a tendency towards laxity or under-enforcement. They may be less safe for the vulnerable. The model we observed in private sector prisons feels a bit like, if this is meaningful language to you, the old dispersal prison model, with some concessions made to quite powerful prisoners or co-option of prisoners into the organisation of others to maintain order. So, for example, it's very typical in a private sector prison to see prisoners observing other prisoners in the classrooms rather than staff. So that there's a kind of dependence on prisoners to fill in the gaps where staff aren't present. The three examples I can give are tea and toast being eaten by staff and prisoners in a very high-tech DJ classroom with signs all over the classroom that said absolutely no tea and no toast must ever be eaten in this room. Everyone just completely ignored the instruction. Or heavy gangster prisoners working in key or trusted positions in the prison who the staff didn't realise were heavy gangsters, whereas anyone from the public sector with a bit of history would have known who they were. And I was offered a beer by prisoners during my early evaluation of Wolds Prison from a stash they showed me under their bed, etc. We've had researchers traumatised by naked prisoners on the landings and various other things that have never happened to any of my team in public sector prisons. So this is a serious point because it means the distribution and use of power between staff and prisoners is slightly inappropriate or naive. Staff concede to prisoners and their senior managers have far more power than in public sector prisons. So somewhere in my presentation, okay, I knew this would happen, I have a nice figure, here it is. If this was organised properly, one is public and one is private. And this is my model of the difference. What you have in the public sector is quite powerful prison staff, exerting quite a lot of resistance upwards, and also exerting quite a lot of power and authority in the direction of prisoners. You've got the absolute opposite in the private sector, quite powerless staff in many ways, with managers having all the power, staff being quite vulnerable, but also prisoners having quite a lot of power. And this is obviously related to pay, conditions, numbers, high turnover, and so on. So I'll do, in my 5 minutes, I'll finish the story, which is, I talked about how important personal development was. We've had a good look in our quality of life survey to see which are the big 5 important dimensions of prison life that explain most of the variation in personal development. And this is really our working model of what a good prison needs to look like. And the dimensions that matter most, that do all the work in explaining high levels of personal development, are humanity, staff professionalism, help and assistance, organisation and consistency, and this one, which is a bit tricky, bureaucratic legitimacy, which is about the system. It's about, do I know how to get out of here and which courses to do and what forms to fill in and how to reduce my risk. So that one is less internal. On the other hand, prisoners score it higher if officers understand how the system works and can give important information to prisoners about that. So it's not that the prison itself can't influence scores there, but these are obviously much more internal. we think this is quite an important model, and I think what I'm trying to argue is that these policing and security and staff professionalism dimensions, which are all about right relationships with power flowing through them, is actually a strength of the public sector at its best. That obviously the weakness of the public sector is when it overdoes power and authority. But we see that kind of staff professionalism in the public sector in a way that is quite hard to achieve in the private sector, given the pay conditions and training and experience level of prison officers. So these are the dimensions that are most important, and they also vary the most. So it means this is an area where you get really important differences between prisons. The good news is it means it's movable. It doesn't have to always be bad. It can be better. I'll come back to that if Fergus gives me time. But here's the explanation. Disciplined staff, length of experience and turnover. What you see in the poor private prisons is an extremely high proportion of prison officers with only 1 year experience and not much of a build-up of professional expertise. What you have in the public sector is the opposite. Lots of staff with 10 years and more experience who probably should have moved on. But what you have in Loudon Grange and Altcourse, the best private prisons, is the beginning of a steady state with quite a majority of officers at the kind of 1 to 6 years. They're staying in the job because it's not so below the threshold that they leave and go on and do other things. One more slide. Okay, this is our sort of conceptual, our attempt to conceptualise all of this and make sense of it, and it's just a sort of heavy, light, absent, present distinction. We're now trying to characterise prisons by 2 axes: heavy, which is sort of traditional, cynical; light, it should be obvious; absent and present. And what we're tending to find is that the public sector is often in this quadrant, with staff tending towards the heavy, traditional, cynical, and lots of staff about. The private sector tends to be down here with a sort of light, absent model, to the extent that it's a sort of insecure, this is staff feeling insecure and being a bit naive, permissive. We started to characterise prisons in this way and think about why it might be and what the implications are. The punchline is that the best prisons should be here, in this empty quadrant. And we can think of some that we'd put there, but that generally there is this sort of tendency for the public sector to be up here and the private sector to be down there. Whitemoor, as I've just discovered it, is sort of heading towards Supermax, this is definitely not the corner to be in. And that we think the best prisons that seem to allow maximum personal development would be about here, with traditional professional prison officers who know how to use their authority, but they use it lightly through relationships. And that this is not the model, because it's too cheap, that's being delivered in the private sector. I'll stop there.
Hi, Kevin Warner's my name. Just a simple question in relation to relationships. Presumably relationships between staff and prisoners need time out of cell. If there's very high lockup time, it's very difficult to build any kind of relationship. And I wonder if there's any difference in terms of that dimension of conditions in the prisons you studied.
Is a nice one because it gives me an opportunity to have a bit of a rant about the Whitemoor study. I will keep it short. It's not just time. What we found going back to a prison that had outstanding relationships 10 years ago and is that they're not there anymore. And there's no trust in Whitemoor. And I did say that at Doncaster, trust reached levels that were too high. That doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be some. A prison can't flow if there isn't some trust. But lots of things have happened. It's not just about time, but it's about the reorganisation of knowledge about prisoners, which has moved off the landings. So what we found at Whitemoor, which is a high security prison with long-term relationships, staff are, first of all, a little bit uncomfortable with their new populations, so they're receiving a different kind of prisoner population. But also the experts about prisoners are now offender managers who work in an offender management unit and psychologists. And it's really striking to me that prisoners just felt not known by staff, and staff felt not entitled to know prisoners. And actually, a member of staff who spends more than 10 minutes with a prisoner at Whitemoor has a security information report filled in on them in case they're being conditioned. So time is an important dimension, but lots of other things are part of what makes these relationships possible.
Just wondering, Alison, what do we need to do in this jurisdiction or any jurisdiction to get prisons into your optimal huddle?
And that's a very tough one. All I can do is, I think I'd go back to the figure, my personal development model, and say, what's this telling us? That we know what a good prison looks like, and we know what the difference is between one that seems to be working reasonably well and one that isn't. I think this message about power and authority is important, that critics of prisons don't like power and authority on the whole. And I think there's a naivety about niceness. And lots of people have written about it. It comes up in the restorative justice literature a lot, that you have to have supportive limit setting, and that just being nice is actually quite dangerous with a population who are looking for ways of improving their self-control. So I think we have to be a bit more sophisticated about the kind of language we're using, what a good relationship looks like. But obviously the thing I haven't mentioned at all is management and leadership. And we're starting to try and understand the storylines of these different prisons. Why are some of them looking so much better than others? And a lot of it is to do with who the senior management team are, being above a resource threshold, having lots of continuity. But it's also about the composition of prison officers and their levels of confidence and all of that stuff. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer, but I think we've got some hints.